Notice that referent power, how heavily loaded it is with that Pearson's R, the 7.18.
Could you give an example?
Is there somebody that you particularly respect in your life? Mm-hmm. If that person had a position of authority over you, right, did you find yourself comfortable entertaining the notions that that person had, their values, or using them as models for your own behavior? Yeah, yeah. So a lot that had to do with the personhood, if you would, of that individual was kind of available to you, and you were willing to incorporate aspects of that into your own self.
So it shapes your attitude.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. And if you shape the attitude, then you can shape the behavior. It kind of follows.
Okay.
What do we know about the Pearson product moment correlation? What percentage of the overall variation in behavior, in this case attitudinal compliance, would referent power explain? Nope. But there's a simple math. There's one simple math operation. You're one step away from it. What's that? Yeah. The Pearson's product moment correlation, or R, is referred to as a correlation of coefficient of correlation, right? There's also a coefficient of determination. It's what you simply square it. So if you square R, and sometimes you'll see this in the literature, R squared, that's the percentage of variation, as if you had a Venn diagram explaining the X, explaining variation in Y. So according to this research, the relationship between referent power and attitudinal compliance is just about 1/2 explained, because 7 squared is 0.49. Now look at the relationship between behavioral compliance and coercive means, coercive expression of power. Over 1/3 of the variation explained there. So that's a pretty powerful one. Notice that when we get down to the 0.335, for example, we're talking about maybe 1/10 of the variation in behavior that's explained by the use of reward power, and not even statistically significant in terms of its relationship to attitudinal compliance. So that gives you some idea of how that stuff kind of breaks down. Well, today we're going to shoot through stuff that we've already gone through right there. We want to talk with you about formalization, talk to you a bit about delegation and principles of delegation. Want to talk with you a good deal about human resources work, because I think we've gotten to the point now where we're going to begin to look not just at organizational theory concepts, but the very management or organizational machinery that represents the ways in which organizations attend to various kinds of activities and functions. So if you know the theory, you're probably more dynamic in your ability to kind of understand what's going on around you, or to help clients better appreciate the organizational realities around them. But to know the organizational systems, the administrative systems, later on it's going to be the budgeting systems and things like this, to have command of those particular kind of things really is one that builds your currency as a manager or administrator. It helps you negotiate the landscape of organizations in a very, very important way. And I think what we'll do is, following spring break, we'll continue for at least one more week in looking at major organizational concepts, trying to draw it in and relate it to the reading content that's been assigned to you, but still very, very much exploring the impact, the significance of these major organizational theory variables. And we'll be looking at technology as one of the major ones. We'll be looking at environment as well. And we'll be looking at those things particularly as they relate to clients. Questions? Okay. Notice that we're defining here, very conventionally, formalization as the extent to which norms of a system are explicit. And that definition actually addresses not just the number of such norms or expectations, but also the specificity by which they're communicated and with which they're known within a system. Some organizations are quite intrusive and quite determined or deterministic in terms of how they want to shape the behavior of individuals, and others far less so. What are some of the ways that a new employee becomes acquainted with the norms of an organization? When you're new to an organization, what do you do or what do you rely upon to have an idea of what's expected of you by way of performance and behavior?
Manual.
Okay, manuals.
Conversations with other people in the same discipline or doing the same task.
Okay. And when you're in those conversations, what kind of topics do you think are you addressing?
You're finding out the informal rules of the organization.
Okay. Okay. Now that's kind of neat because JJ's talking about manuals, and are you likely to find out the formal or the informal rules of an organization through a manual?
Formal.
The formal, right? And if you have like procedural handbooks and policy handbooks, that's all going to be formal, 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 formal. Okay? But we now know, if you didn't already, that every formal organization also gives birth to a variety of informal organizations that it continues to host as well. And so what Christina's alluding to in terms of the conversations with peers, and particularly if you're talking about the informal ways of getting things done, the who do you go to, who do you really go to find out this, that, or the other thing, who do you really go to get something done, to get permission for something or whatever, then you're really talking about the informal organization as well.
I'm probably a little strange, but I'm a big one for observing.
Mm-hmm.
I learn by observing
Mm-hmm.
and then duplicating.
It's an entirely appropriate way of doing it. It's an entirely appropriate way. And I think it's a necessary way, as a matter of fact, not just appropriate, it's necessary. For one thing, if you just stick with the manuals, all you're getting is the formal stuff. So you're only getting one side of the coin, if you will. And if you're relying upon the advice of others or the counsel of others, you might not know at the beginning how good the advice is from the people that you're talking with, particularly if they're new to you as well. And what might work for one person might not work for another. Some doors that are available, say in the informal organization, may only be available for people who've kind of earned their stripes in the informal organization, who've proven themselves and remain closed or difficult to access for newbies in the organization. So observation becomes an important kind of thing there. Mm-hmm.
On training, if you have a new person on our team and a technical trainer, sometimes you put thinking informal, formal. I'm like, well, this is what policy says. It's like, no, you do it either this way or this way or this way.
That's
So
right.
I was just thinking in my head, I'm like, oh, agents, it's everywhere.
Glad to see you're getting your money's worth. Of course, I took it an extra step, perhaps. Now, we've talked before, and somewhat obliquely in ways, about how organization is a way of structuring behavior. It's a way of reducing the uncertainty of behavior for the people who occupy particular positions within particular organizations. Professionals are involved in a process that does the same thing in many respects, but does it in a different way. A lot of professional education and professional socialization are designed also to reduce the uncertainty or the unpredictability of your behavior given certain situations. So when you're taught in classes, for example, about particular ways of establishing relationships, about particular ways of pursuing relationships by contracting, the psychological contract with a client, about meeting a client and where they are non-judgmentally, right? Look at the words I'm using here. I'm prescribing ways of conducting yourselves. And if you do that, while there are still a wide variety of ways of doing that, each in the end particular to every individual, the intent is to drive out all other forms of interacting with the client at that point in time in a helping process. So professional education, professional socialization are also ways of trying to make behavior more predictable. But as we've mentioned before, an organization operates with its own logic at the forefront, its mission, where it resides within an interorganizational environment, its goals, not just the official goals, but what are the immediate and operative goals? Where are you within the organization? What is your title? What niche, formal niche particularly, do you occupy there? You may have your MSW degree, for example, but if you're a caseworker 1, you're going to be expected to behave somewhat differently than a clinical supervisor, maybe 3 steps up in the hierarchy of the organization. The degree is the same degree. The profession is the same profession, but the position within the organization calls for different responsibilities with different authority and probably a different perspective. And so we come back to this notion of formalization and the profession. And research shows, in general, a relatively significant and inverse or negative relationship in terms of bureaucracies as they emphasize formality, particularly as that relates to the way you do your job, and professional level of satisfaction in employment, because those very prescriptions from the organization in terms of how you do your job run counter to one of the basic principles of professional education, professional socialization. And that is, only those who have the professional training experience are competent to make decisions about self-supervision in the way one conducts oneself professionally. So as I've mentioned before, job discretion becomes a particularly important concept when we're looking at various organizational variables, particularly around rules, particularly around formalization. You can have all the rules in the organization around clothing, around deportment, around reporting. Did I say reporting already? Can't remember what it was. A variety of other kind of aspects of the work environment. But if you preserve as a professional field with professional autonomy for the individual around the core technology, the core professional client relationship in the case of social work, then what you tend to do is you tend to minimize the discomfiture of the professional within that organization. So high levels of job discretion, even if it's associated with high levels of formalization, may in fact still provide for a very comfortable working relationship for professionals within a bureaucracy. Now we see that very, very frequently with physicians. We see that very, very frequently with lawyers. We see it less frequently with social workers. And a lot of it has to do with the power of the professions in our culture, and then the ability of individual practitioners to be an expression or to give expression to that power. In major medical centers, it may be very, very common for somebody with a health administration degree to be the chief executive officer of a hospital. But who's the chief medical officer? It's going to be a physician, right? And the medical team is going to be dominated by physicians. And the culture of the organization is going to be dominated by physicians. It's not going to be dominated by the chief executive officer with his administrative degree. And so when you're practicing medicine in our culture, it's almost a given that the practice of medicine is largely one which is governed by the various medical professions, particularly according to their kind of hierarchy, power hierarchy within the culture. What happened when managed care came along? began to change that equation a great deal, didn't it? And didn't we begin to see at that point in time many people in the medical professions, particularly physicians, expressing considerable discomfiture, considerable frustration with the inability to practice medicine as each and every one of those individuals deemed it appropriate to practice. Right? And that would be a variety of ways of doing it. But it was an example of how managed care began to push formalization, push rules, push accountability into the practice of a profession that before that had been pretty effective in protecting itself and protecting that kind of cocoon. Why do you think social work has not been as, or do you agree that social work hasn't been as effective in preserving that same level or a comparable level of autonomy for professional practice within organizations?
What was the first part of that? You think we've done a good job or a poor job?
That's my question.
Okay.
Do you think we've done a good job or a poor job?
I think we're on a poor job.
Okay, we got one vote for poor job. Make your case.
I think it's in our nature to work with other people, and so we might not try to be on top.
Okay.
And sometimes it takes that attitude to get the power you're talking about.
Okay, so that may be one of the attitudinal correlates of being a social worker, or at least for many, many people, is the willingness to work with as opposed to impose one's will on. And that would make a logical sense. That would make logical sense for that to be.
I think businesses are trying to survive, and there's just not the money there. I mean, if your source is tin care, God help you.
So does that translate into more or less success for social workers protecting the autonomy of practice?
Less success.
Less success. Is it also a possibility that we as a profession just command less power within culture? And so no matter what we might want to do, it's more difficult for us to resist the same level of, let's say, efforts at control within an organization? I think I'd make that argument.
It's just valued less.
What's that now?
I think our work is just valued less, like it was talking about in the book, under their disciplinary team, the nurses and doctors aren't going to do the same respect. Just the nature of the beast as it is nowadays.
Yeah, and our culture doesn't do, our society doesn't do that, give us the same level of respect as others. And respect is one of those things that you can translate into a source of power. It becomes a kind of a type of referent power or expression of that.
Well, they need to be educated. They need to be educated. We did in our research project last year, we took a survey of what people knew about the role of a social worker. And I had professional people that worked like in a medical setting that their coworkers didn't know all the things she was capable of doing. Right in the agency didn't know that she could be a therapist and just all of the many things that she was trained and licensed to do. They had no idea.
Is it possible also that our contributions, even when we do them very, very well, are not as valued as the contributions of some of the members of other professions, for example? So much of the time, we're working with people who are disadvantaged or relatively powerless or extraordinarily powerless. And so their ability to reward the profession through their gratitude is minimal compared to the power of economic elites to reward other folks, engineers, lawyers, physicians, and others who perhaps would be contributing, no more importantly to them, but still contributing to them.
And I think our work is not as tangible. I mean, I don't think our work can be seen. So it's harder, more difficult to measure as well.
I think you're exactly right. And you're actually anticipating something we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks when we talk about technology and human services. We have some of the more indeterminate technologies, and the opportunity for us to provide really clear measurements of effectiveness is far diminished, or far less so than many of the other kind of professions that we're talking about.
This situation arose with me actually last week in a hospital with my parents. And then I actually got to deal with it this weekend with the foundational director of the hospital that my parents were in. And because they discharged him early, no family saw the physician, and he's got dementia. So he was discharged with dementia, with returning homeward, and I just started talking to the foundational director, and she said, we have to address this. You need to schedule an appointment with me. She said, how did you notice everything was going wrong? And I said, lack of communication. And me as a social worker, that kicking in, that helped her understand, because she didn't know anything about the developmental, or she didn't know anything about foundational work until she first started that position, because she was an MBA, and she was hired because she was an MBA. She said, I need to understand from your perspective how this hospital needs to work better. So, I mean, it can arise even in personal situations.
But it certainly very much does.
So-
Certainly very much does.
And where a doctor needs to listen to a family member as well.
Right.
So,
Now, in terms of, was this at a nursing home or a hospital itself?
hospital,
Hospital, okay.
on a med-surg floor.
I'm not being a physician, I can't speak to the restrictions other than the technological ones that impinge upon a physician's ability to engage in the practice of medicine as he or she would see fit to do. But in human services, social services, isn't it quite common that solutions to problems will already be prepackaged for people? And that many times we'll make admissions decisions about whether or not to even accept a client based upon our notion as to whether or not this particular technology that we're wedded to is going to be useful or not. Now, from a professional perspective, that seems to me to be extraordinarily backwards, because aren't you being taught to get a better idea of what a person's presenting problem and resources and deficits, both strengths and weaknesses are, to work with their goals as well, to meld those to the kind of things that you're available to help them do, and then from that to work with them to develop a strategy in response? Oh, wait a minute. And instead, we've just talked about an organization imposing a set of solutions on you as a practitioner as a condition of perhaps not just of the admission or eligibility of the client, but perhaps as well as a condition for your very employment. Now, if you violate that expectation in terms of practice, you're not playing by the organizational rules. Now, you may very much be playing by what's expected of the profession, but not expected by the organization. And that's an example of a real life example many times of how formalization and the influence of the organization in impinging upon the job discretion of the professional can in fact create the conditions where a person can be very, very much disappointed and disaffected with his or her employment, with his or her practice in that organization. And one would argue from a professional perspective that it also is deleterious to the effectiveness of treatment to the client.
So what's the breaking point? Your ethical values, code of ethics?
Well, that's one of the things that one has to consider, but there are no absolutes here. So economic realities for you also are certainly important. The availability of alternatives for the client are particularly important.
But especially in the medical profession, the bottom line is do no harm. You know, if rules aren't flexible so that there's exceptions, you know, to certain things, then
I encounter that situation a lot working with nursing facilities, because a lot of the bureaucracy in the nursing facility goes against my professional rules and ethics as a social worker. However, in order to be efficient, there are some things that I don't necessarily look over, but I'm very aware and attuned to know that if I'm not attuned to these things, then I'm booted out, basically, and no one will be serviced. That's the only way that I've been able, does that make sense, JJ? The only way that I'm very aware and very attuned to them, because if you turn blindly to them, it's terrible. But
it might not be the best outcome.
it's
for
not the best outcome, but
everyone.
But
if you're gone, then no one
then
is going to have the benefit of your
Right.
ethics and your values.
Right, so it's the organizational rules and then your professional rules. They're not the same at all in that setting.
We're talking about the nuances of the ethics involved in working with clients in real life situations. I think so long as you keep the client's interest at the forefront, start with that, don't waver from that, and then the other things probably will present opportunities for you. In other words, you'll probably find ways of reconciling the fact that you can't make any two values simultaneously supreme. You can always make one value supreme, or you can pursue that, but you can never do that with two. And so if it's the client's interest, the client's welfare that you keep number one, then it's been my experience that in most cases you're able to negotiate the other kind of conditions, and there will be times when you won't, and it will be painful for you. It'll probably be painful for the client as well, and those are the things that you simply have to endure. And at some point they may be so critical, or they may be so numerous, or other things in your life may be going in that you decide, this isn't for me anymore. I have to make a decision with regard to self-care that I can't put off anymore. That's entirely appropriate, because if you don't attend to self-care, ultimately you're not going to be able to attend to any other kind of care. More on this? Anybody want to chime in? Your authors, I think, do a very good job of describing in the chapter that was actually the chapter for last week the various ways in which formalization is expressed, the ways in which it's communicated to people, the ways in which organizations and folks in the organization shape behavior. And remember, they distinguish between, in terms of formal kind of things, policies, rules, and procedures. I've included job descriptions as well, because I think that's a very important way in which organizations prescribe behavior and try and begin to rule out variation on those things, make particular individuals accountable for particular kinds of behaviors ultimately. Also with regard to performance evaluation, a very important and formal way in which feedback is provided to an employee as to what behaviors are valued by the organization and which are not. And again, from a performance evaluation standpoint, that tends to be an expression of organizational values as seen by primarily one person. Who's that one person? Your supervisor. That's right, your supervisor. Yeah. And then adverse actions. Now, what are adverse actions?
Make a mistake.
Keep going. What's that? Punishment. Yeah, it's really formal punishment. You make a big mistake, right? That's what we're talking about. You make a mistake that's written up, right? And the organization responds with some kind of formal sanction that's imposed against you. And it may be a written admonishment, for example, or warning. Many organizations now will have a progressive discipline policy that they'll use to try and shape behavior. For example, the first time you notice something that's a problem, you might be expected to inform the individual somewhat casually. If this perhaps the second time you see the same kind of thing, again, perhaps another oral warning may be indicated, but this time in a more formal nature, calling the individual into your office, perhaps explaining certain dimensions of job performance or procedure. The third time you see the same kind of thing happening, your policy might call for a written letter of admonishment that is to go into the individual's file. Perhaps it goes no farther than that. Fourth time you see it, another letter of admonishment, but this time a copy of it also goes up to your supervisor. So now other people are being made aware of it. Perhaps the fifth time you see it, this isn't absolutely ridiculous, folks. There are actually policies that are quite like this. Fifth time you see it, it may be some kind of mandatory reduction in pay. It might be a suspension for a day or two from the job or something like that. And it quite likely the entire sequence of such progressively more severe and more formal adverse actions required that would finally eventuate in termination. But in many organizations, that entire spectrum of adverse actions will need to have been exhausted before the ultimate organizational sanction is actually employed.
At Walgreens, where my husband works as a pharmacist,
Mm-hmm.
3 write-ups in any 12-month period.
3 write-ups and you're gone. Yeah.
No verbals.
Different organizations will have different policies. And the key is going to be, for the most part, is it objective? Is it formalized? Is there an opportunity for the individual, the employee, to have voice in this, to have some kind of appeal or whatever? Is it a policy that in operation operates equally and fairly across all individuals in that status within the organization? And chances are, if you have followed those kind of rules, you'll probably meet most of the kind of legal tests that one might find that a disgruntled employee might use to avoid that kind of punishment or to seek redress.
Is Tennessee a hire and fire at will state?
My understanding is that it is. Yes, my understanding is it is. Unless you're civil service. That's right. But even said that, even if that's the case, I'm going to go back to Texas. When I was living in Texas, Texas was also an at-will state. And it kind of came down to this. Employers could hire or fire pretty much at will. But you couldn't fire for the wrong reasons, just as you could hire for the wrong reasons. That could also get you into trouble. So even though it was an at-will state, there were still provisions with regard to equal employment opportunity that would govern, and that there were still also provisions that would protect protected classes of people from certain categories of behavior. So there was a case, for example, at the university where I worked with, where a president was fired by the equivalent of the Board of Regents when the governorship changed parties. It went from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to the Republican. And the president was known as one of the people who was fairly highly positioned in the kind of the inner circle of the former governor's party. And the new governor came in, appointed some new people to the Board of Regents, and almost immediately the president of the university where I was working at was fired. Now he then turned around and sued in a federal court. And what was interesting is that several members of the regents were required to provide testimony. And several of them admitted that they had cast their vote to fire the president for political reasons. Had they simply said, I had no reason to do what I did, I just felt like doing it, that would have been legal. But in Texas, it was against the law to fire somebody for political purposes, for their political affiliation. And so this particular president received a $400,000 or $800,000 reward, the title of President Emeritus, and had his picture rehung in the administration building. Now, what are some informal methods for shaping behavior in organizations? Well, information, kind of thing that you were talking about when you were talking about how you kind of get to know what the policies are, what the procedures are, particularly the informal one. Advice from coworkers, especially. Could also be from your boss. Doesn't have to be formal. Advice, by the nature of the definition, is something that you can accept or reject. Directives, by definition, that's not something that you can simply accept or reject without fear of some kind of consequence. The expectation is that one will follow it. Example, and of course, the group pressures that we've alluded to and talked about in the past. Groups is a very, very important, very, very powerful socializing force within the organization. Now, I want to transition. We're going to take a break in just a second here. But I want to then transition into some the organizational processes themselves for a while. We've been talking a good deal about creating organization, if you will. We've been talking about how power is distributed intentionally, unevenly across the organization, how that hierarchy develops. Your chapter, your authors in today's chapter talked about creating departments, creating positions in a logical way, and various ways of organizing those positions. So I want us to go behind the doors of the personnel office, a human resources office. And we'll take a look at the part of the organization that has a primary responsibility for doing those very kind of things. Now, we're not going to be talking about budget today. That's going to be coming in just a few weeks. But we will spend an entire day talking about budget issues. We'll talk about budgeting in both public and private sectors. We'll talk budgeting as a management system to account for money, but we'll also talk about budgeting as a part of the planning process. Operations, we'll talk a bit about operations next week when we're talking about technology. And that's really how one controls the intentional flow of raw materials to the organization as they are transformed and eventually provided to the environment. And we'll talk today some also about the impact of unions and collective bargaining on the structure of organization, the structure of power, and on the way that rules and the way that politics play out within organizations. But before we get into that kind of stuff, why don't you take 10 minutes?